Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteus, and today we will be diving into the recent Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement. In a recent development, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called off a cabinet vote on the ceasefire deal, accusing Hamas of re-engaging some terms, a claim the Palestinian group strongly denies. Hamas official Izzat al-Razek has stated the agreement reached in Doha, mediated by Qatar, meets all of the group's conditions, including the full withdrawal of Israeli forces, the return of displaced people to their homes, and the permanent end of the war. This follows the announcement of an initial ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas after more than 15 months of intense conflict. The deal, mediated by Qatar, Egypt, and the US, sets a 6-week pause in hostilities. It includes the release of 33 hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, the return of displaced Palestinians, and the arrival of essential humanitarian aid. Despite ongoing challenges, including Israeli strikes that have killed at least 40 Palestinians in the past 24 hours, celebrations erupt in Gaza as news of the ceasefire spread. The first phase of the agreement is set to begin on Sunday, January the 19th. For this discussion, we are joined by Elizabeth Larus, non-resident fellow Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, live from Washington. We are also joined by Lev Aran, former coordinator of Israel-India Parliamentary Friendship, live from Israel. Scott Faulkner, former Chief Administration Officer to the US House of Representatives and Director of Personnel for the Reagan campaign, live from Washington. And Mohammed El-Dashan, Director of Oxcon Fragile State Consulting, live from London. Thank you all for joining us. We obviously have this recent update from Israel. Elizabeth, I wanted to come to you first. How do you interpret Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to call off the cabinet vote on this ceasefire deal?
Well, apparently the cabinet is, or the political parties and the cabinet are quite split right now about the hostage trade. That seems to be a sticking point. My understanding is that Hamas would release about 30 hostages, some dead and the others alive, in return for about 1,000 prisoners in Israeli prisons who have been convicted of acts of terrorism and murder. And there are a couple of political parties in Israel that do not believe that that is a fair trade. And so that apparently is a sticking point in Israel. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying that Hamas is balking at the 11th hour about some of the conditions, though I have not seen him indicate publicly what those conditions are. So apparently there is some divisions in Israeli domestic government right now that is holding up approval of this first phase of the plan.
Lev Aran, Hamas has denied going back on these terms of the agreement and claims that all the conditions were met. How can such starkly opposing narrative be reconciled in future negotiations? Lev Aran?
Look, yes. Although I see a consensus in Israeli media among Israeli pundits that although we see that now the government is thinking about the deal again, there will be a deal, and the reason is simple: everybody wants to be in Trump's good books, and when Trump speaks about hell in Gaza, Palestinians know that he will let Israel do anything in Gaza if they do not comply with the deal. And also Netanyahu knows that if he lets the fringe, right-wing fringe in Israel to break this deal, he will lose his government, he will lose also the next elections. So even if right now it seems for the last hour, even hour and a half, that maybe this deal will not be manifested, I see a full consensus in Israel that we will see a deal.
Thank you. How does the involvement of Qatar and all the Egyptian and the US help this ceasefire deal go through? And what do you think they will think of this recent development? Scott Faulkner, I want your thoughts on this.
Well, the key is in all this is that we're only a few days away from Trump becoming president. And of course, in the last few weeks, he said if there wasn't a hostage deal, there'd be hell unleashed. And so I think that there was a lot of pressure, especially on Hamas, to try to do something, even though it's a deal that really benefits Hamas a lot more than Israel at the moment. But I think also Israel knows that once Trump is in office, he's going to reverse a lot of policies that were pro-Iranian, and Iran, which is obviously the big fundraiser and funder and advisor to Hamas, is going to be taken offline in various ways. And so I think that the deal is bad. The deal will probably still go through, but I think the next phases are going to be dependent on what Trump does with Iran.
Mohammed El-Dashan, we heard that Israel might benefit more from this ceasefire agreement. But what do you think the most significant points are of this ceasefire agreement? And what do they address or fail to address the root causes of the conflict?
Thank you for that. That is quite a complex question. But let me just highlight a couple of points. This is a ceasefire during a time of genocide, and therefore it is not a good deal for the Palestinians. But we're at a point where the number of people dying is innumerable. We are literally in the hundreds of thousands. Regarding the conversation about the votes in the Israeli cabinet, I think it's important to go back just 48 hours ago, where the Minister of Interior, Itamar Ben-Gvir, once the sketches of the current ceasefire suggestion deal were announced, essentially took to the internet and said that he has foiled plans for a ceasefire multiple times over the past year, and are calling on his fellow extremists within the Israeli government to foil this one as well. This is reported by, essentially, I mean, he put that on Twitter. It was reported by all Israeli media. I think the Jerusalem Post broke that first, and the leader of the opposition, actually, Yair Lapid, came out and said, I've been telling you for a year that we've had ceasefire offers, and that the Israeli government has chosen not to pursue them. Right. So there is a deliberate choice on the part of the Israeli cabinet, and now it's really public out there. They're actually bragging about it, that they have delayed and foiled attempts at stopping this war and at releasing the hostages, which is inconceivable, and it should be. We should not forget that overall situation. I will add that, currently Israel has another ceasefire ongoing with Lebanon, and which over the last 2 months it has violated upwards of 450 times. And the day before yesterday was saying that it actually intends not to abide by the terms of it and to withdraw to where it promised it would withdraw within 60 days of the agreement from late November. So we're talking about an actor that is very much belligerent and that has absolutely no desire or intention to abide by ceasefire, and this is where we're at. Since the immediately after the announcement of the deal 2 days ago, people in Gaza sort of came out to breathe fresh air, and the Israelis bombed them and killed 40 people who were literally just out on the streets celebrating the end of the genocide, or at least pardon the genocide. So it must be very clear that we're in a situation where if that ceasefire deal fails, it will, like any suggestion of a ceasefire deal over the past 15 months, will be squarely the responsibility and the deliberate choice of the Israelis, which is deeply unfortunate for everyone.
Lev Aran, I wanted to get your direct response to that, with allegations obviously on both sides regarding breaches of ceasefire deals or unmet conditions. How can the international community ensure transparency, and how can Hamas and Israel ensure transparency when this ceasefire goes through?
It seems like the international community understands that Hamas cannot rule Gaza. They murdered a lot of Palestinian Authority and PLO members and bureaucrats in Gaza. and then they murdered and raped 1,200 Israelis. And as far as Hamas is concerned, there is not a single square feet in Israel that is really Israel. All of it belongs to Palestine. So anyway, Hamas is not a partner. Now, on the other hand, the big problem is that the Palestinian Authority is, a venal and corrupt entity. And out of every rupee that you give them, about 65 paisa go to pockets of bigwigs in the PLO and Palestinian Authority. So also nobody is really banking on the Palestinian Authority, although they are the legitimate player that should rule Gaza, I think, according to the international law. So at the end of the game, we will have to find, the international community will have to find a strong player from the Emirates or maybe Qatar, maybe other players, maybe Turkey, that will help the local Palestinian leadership to lead Gaza in a way that we will not see a second October 7th, because we see that once we have such a mass murder, we also have a war of over a year. And I want to agree with Muhammad that we had the same deal since at least April 2024. And we could have the same deal as Israel and as Hamas, even like 7 months, 8 months back. And we all regret that we lost these, we lost like 8-9 months that those hostages could be alive, and we don't know which one are alive and which ones are dead. Thank you.
Elizabeth, I want to bring you in here. What measures would be necessary to move this temporary truce, its end goal, to be a lasting peace? And how can the US work with its allies to strengthen the terms of this ceasefire?
I think that having a lasting peace is going to be very difficult when you have two parties that are committed to extinguishing each other. Right? Israel really wants to extinguish Hamas because it doesn't want another attack like October 7th, and it doesn't want another war, because these wars are politically, unpopular in Israel as well. And Hamas is sworn to extinguish Israel. So it's very, very difficult unless there is some type of a solution that the parties can both agree, this is my territory, this is your territory, we're not going to attack each other. And we just really haven't seen that in the last, 50, 60 years. So I think it'll be very difficult. I think with the Trump administration coming in, I think their Middle East policy in the last administration was quite effective, much more so than Biden administration. And so the U.S., again, has a very large role. Obviously, it has quite close relations with Israel and can use that to put a lot of leverage on Israel. And then, as Iran has said, that the Middle Eastern countries, they want to see this resolved as well. And they can work, perhaps communicate a bit more with Hamas, on that side, and bring the two to a table that I think can honestly, at best, limp along in a series of ceasefires rather than a permanent peace solution.
Scott Faulkner, is this ceasefire a step forward in addressing the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or is it merely a tactical pause for both sides to regroup?
Again, nothing's going to be solved in the Middle East until Iran's influence and money is neutralized. And I think everybody knows that. And so, but on the other hand, there's always been political pressure on the Israeli government to bring these hostages back. On one front, we certainly want to see families reunited, bodies returned, but it's a very bad precedent because from now on, every terrorist group in the region, their first priority will be to grab hostages, and that's a very sad turn of events.
I wanted to move on to the second segment of this debate, which I want to talk about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Mohammed al-Dashan, obviously, the low estimates of Palestinians killed are over 46,000 people. These came after the October 7th attacks, which killed many civilians, over 1,000 civilians in Israel. With recent airstrikes in Gaza today, how can a ceasefire agreement be structured to prevent civilian casualties in the interim leading up to Sunday?
I mean, you're absolutely right that the numbers are staggering. But as I said, we have to remember that these are the very much low estimates of death in Palestine. We're actually talking genuinely upwards of 400,000 if you include all the people who died from their injuries. So this is a genocide. It's what you very much need is a genuine commitment to negotiation for an end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is an occupation that must end, and the Israelis essentially hold pretty much all the cards, and this is very much a decision on their hands. The fact that we've had movement on this current ceasefire a couple of days before the end of President Biden's term is very much a reflection that Washington and Israel are the ones that are calling the shots here. So it must be said that this is not a war of equals. This is very much one occupying party, one belligerent that has endless firepower and that is able to exact that type of violence. Worth mentioning that prior to October 7th, human rights organizations issued reports saying that 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinian children, and that's before October 7th. That's before the beginning of the genocide. So this is not, this war or this conflict, as you know better than I do, is something that didn't start 15 months ago. This is a long-term occupation. Regarding the humanitarian crisis, it is immensely true that we have a humanitarian crisis, and now hopefully, if that ceasefire holds, we'll be able to move to reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, so that people are able to go home, so they can restore electricity and power and homes and hospitals and schools and water supply and all of that. Once again, this is largely controlled by the Israelis. They essentially hold the button to allow that to happen or not. Humanitarian organizations are kind of on standby, waiting to be allowed into the Gaza Strip. So it is very much my hope that the Israelis will stop delaying access of humanitarian supply, will stop delaying the end of the war, and allow the reconstruction process to begin. And this begins with the Israeli government, but likewise with the Israeli public opinion, which is quite split. But it is my hope that there still is a peace camp within Israel, small as it might be, that believes that mass murder is wrong, and one cannot believe that this is a point that needs to be made. But in this imbalance of power, the only thing we can do is sort of appeal to the better nature of humans, because this stopped being a political dispute a long time ago.
Elizabeth Larus, the first phase of the ceasefire deal calls for mass humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. Can both Israel and Hamas be trusted in this aid getting to the people that need it the most?
Well, yeah, question of trust. Look, there's always going to be some corruption, some diversion of funds and food, but I don't think anyone disputes that aid needs to go in. The question is it the International Red Cross, the Red Crescent? Questionable if Israel is going to allow UNRWA back in. That is the UN body that aids the Palestinians, and if Trump administration would agree to that. And so it's a question, who's going to be bringing this aid in? But I think everyone agrees that this is the time it needs to go in. We can't have people living in tents. They have nothing to go home to. And we do want people to go home. And so what's going to be a home? A tent? And they need food. So the aid absolutely needs to go in. And yes, some of it's going to be diverted. There will be some corruption. But it's just, what else are you going to do? It needs to be done.
Lev Aran, what specific measures can Israel take to minimize civilian casualties while addressing security concerns in future escalations?
Look, I believe that if the food that gets inside will not be stolen by Hamas, because what happened is that I go back to Iran, okay? What happened is that Hamas had a lot of money from Iran, from Qatar, from other entities. And once they lost this money after the war, their source of money was the food that Israel gave to Gaza. And then they stole the food, they overpriced it, and they taxed it. This is the reason why Hamas still has money inside Gaza. So I hope that after this agreement and after we have some kind of normalcy in Gaza and the normal government in Gaza, food will not be a problem in Gaza. And in Gaza, we will see, a fruitful, productive government who wants to live in peace with Israel, who sees Gaza as Palestine and Israel as Israel. And once this happens, we will have also a lasting peace between Israel and Palestine.
Scott Faulkner, do you think that the US should condition aid to Israel or Palestine on humanitarian improvements? And why or why not?
What's so sad and what's the fundamental issue is here is that in 2003, when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip, it could have been the next Dubai. They could have built luxury hotels, they could have built condominiums, they could have built mansions and have become a hub of tourism on prime Mediterranean real estate. Instead, the billions of aid that went in there was diverted to tunnels and terrorism. The hospitals were built and ill-staffed, mostly as a camouflage for the tunnels. The schools were camouflage for tunnels and for creating human shields. The whole concept of the last couple decades has been to create a terrorism hotbed to attack Israel and any other pro-Israeli entity in the region. It's just sad that we need to impose something, from whether it's Qatar, whether it's UAE, whether it's Saudi Arabia. Someone needs to come in there and tap the actual economic and geographic potential of the Gaza Strip. And until that happens, we're going to keep having these problems.
Mohammed, for this last question on this topic, I want to ask you, how can a humanitarian framework become a central part of ceasefire negotiations rather than a seeming afterthought?
Thank you. You're absolutely right. This is a situation that is a humanitarian crisis like we've not seen often in our lifetimes. And so it must be, first, humanitarian organizations must be given free access to the victims, to be able to supply goods when necessary to restore basic services and rebuild, etc. All of that needs to be done urgently, and this will require lots of financing. Because, Israel has this literally bombed every single hospital in the Gaza Strip, is pretty much every single school, and upwards of 70% of the housing stock. Can you imagine that 70% of the houses are destroyed? So all of that will need to be rebuilt, but the immediate needs are basic food and water. And it cannot be that that the Israelis are choosing to control the, how do I say that? Like, it's essentially, it drops and drops of food while trucks are actually queuing at the border. There are literally trucks queuing at the Egyptian Gaza crossing, which is now controlled by the Israelis, and they refuse access of humanitarian aid. So there must be a clear willingness on the part of the Israeli to reverse the humanitarian damage and the human and social damage that they've caused. A big part of that, I think, will require the media to actually emphasize or make people understand what the situation is. This is not a discussion behind closed doors.
Mohammed, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to finish on a final question. Is the current ceasefire deal a stepping stone to a two-state solution, or has the window for such a resolution closed? Elizabeth, what do you think about this?
Well, there's certainly hope for that. I think it's going to be a long road. I know that sounds trite, but let's see how this first phase goes. There's 3 phases, and we haven't even pulled off. Well, the first phase was supposed to start on Sunday. So, let's hope and pray that goes forward. And then let's see. The answer is, if there is going to be a 2-state solution, it's not going to happen in the next couple of years. It's going to be down the road.
Lev, Iran, what are your thoughts on that?
For many years, there was a majority in Israel that we need a 2-state solution. We need a normal border with the Palestinians. And I believe this majority we will see this majority again once Israelis will believe that the Palestinians want only a chunk of the land and not all of it.
Guys, I'm very, very sorry. We have completely run out of time. Thank you very much, all the guests, for joining us today on this momentous day. That's all we have time for now. We will continue to bring more updates on the Gaza situation and other stories from across the world. Thank you very much.